Thank you very much for this space. It's very important for us to talk about this topic. It's a concept and a topic that has had a huge growth in the southern countries, especially Latin America and Spain, and we'll discuss what's going on around it. Well, I'm Michelle Sadler from Chile, University of Chile. I'm a medical anthropologist, and
I'm Ibone.
Ibone from Spain. Ibone is a psychiatrist, and we're both researchers and activists on these topics. Ibone, founder, member of El Parto es Nuestro, which is translated as "Birth is Ours," "Childbirth is Ours," very strong Spanish association. I'm founder member of RALACAUPAN, which is the Latin American and Caribbean Association for Humanization of Childbirth, created in the year 2000. So we are both in the research university worlds and in the activist world, trying to collaborate between worlds to discuss all these topics. And our start on this topic, or our interests, come from different life stories. Can I speak for you? Ibone first had 3 traumatic cesarean sections of her kids, which are now teenagers, and she became interested in these topics from that life experience, which was very hurting for her. And they started working with other women and creating the association. On the other hand, I was an undergraduate student observing hospital births in Chile, and I couldn't believe the level of abuse, of mistreatment that I was observing. So I said I would never go through this. And I had my kids 5 years ago, and I had the most wonderful and amazing and my ideal births, and there they are. They are 4 and 5. You can see them. And so when we met some years ago in Chile in a conference about these topics, we were doing the same things, and we were wanting more women to have the opportunity to have these experiences, and more health professionals, and less women to go through what Ibone went through. All of our kids are healthy kids, fantastic kids, amazing kids, but Ibone had a much more difficult beginning than I did. And this is what we want to discuss today. So I will start the presentation, and then Ibone will follow, and I left them in Greece, and I came here. So what we're going to discuss today is, what is this concept of obstetric violence? What is it addressing? And is it the same than all this discussion of abuse, disrespect, or mistreatment of women that is going on in the World Health Organization in many papers lately? And we want to frame this public health problem in a discussion of cultural and ideological structures, such as health systems and gender, and develop its consequences in childbirthing women, health workers, and in society as a whole. And first, we want to start with some concepts that will frame all this discussion. And from social sciences, and here we have anthropologists, psychologists, sociologists, we have been discussing for decades biomedicine, the model of health. We have all been trained it as a cultural system, and also as an androcentric system, male-centered, and which has seen the physiological female processes as mainly pathological. We have had many research on this. Robbie Davis Floyd, which you may know, I'm a North American anthropologist, she's talking about for long now, about the technocratic model of birth, where physiology is the focus. So what we are learning is mainly physiology and biology and the material body, and not the emotions and spirituality and other aspects of the human being. And as well, where there's a devaluation of women. If you have read, for example, Emily Martin's work, The Woman in the Body, fantastic. She's discussing how in the language we're always talking about the physiological female processes as degenerative, as pollution, as in negative terms. So how is this embodied, and how are we recreating this vision of the female body in the medical system? So Robbie Davis Floyd develops 12 principles of this model, which can be summarized in this image. This is a Chilean birthing room of a hospital, a public hospital. And of course, we can see that here the center is not the woman as an organism, as a human being, but as a body, as a piece of body, as a uterus. Here, this is a, how do you call them, a rubbish bag? Plastic, yeah. So what's going on behind this model of birth that is still extremely hegemonic in many places of the world? So Robbie Davis Floyd will tell us, well, the hospital is a metaphor of a factory, and for decades the babies were kept away from the mothers in the nurseries. the baby is the product, and I don't know in English, but in Spanish we still talk about the baby como producto. So midwives will say el producto all the time, and they're talking about the baby. So which are the metaphors there? The woman's body is a defective machine that needs intensive use of technology because she cannot give birth by itself. We need to. So instead of seeing birth as a physiological process which needs intervention only when necessary, we are doing the opposite. We're intervening all cases and treating all women as the same kind of patient that needs to have induction, membrane rupture, blah, 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 blah. And these are, I didn't know how to call them in English, but against authorization is what have we done in this model? So we are homogenizing women. They're all patients and numbers of clinical cards or whatever. They're seen first as pathology, other than physiology. We're fragmentating, and still in the medical textbooks that we use, we are only having pieces of women, of uterus, models, and we're not seeing the wholeness of persons. Naturalizing them, seeing them as this kind of, this has to be with sexualizing, with many words are said, for example, that you don't need to explain them, they will not understand. Like, and many sexual jokes about it, many contamination. We have an aseptic place of birth, and the woman is something external that contaminates symbolically and also physically. I even got to observe one time a baby being had a skin to skin contact, and they had put plastic between the mother and the baby. Yeah, plastic, because the mom would contaminate the baby. So this is very and of course blaming, because if the woman internalizes all this, then she is to blame for the bad outcomes or the bad. So this is also full in testimonies. So what has happened with this concept, and I will tell you next where it comes from, but the concept, it goes beyond the abuse and disrespect or mistreatment, because when we read the literature on these concepts, there's a recent systematic review that has 7 categories. Most of them are centered in interpersonal relations. It's health professionals that are doing a physical or verbal abuse, that are blaming the woman, that are saying bad words, that are doing... and less of it, much less of the literature is centered on the structural factors that create these interactions. What is happening to those health workers that they are doing this? Are they bad people? No, they're not bad people. They're very pressed. They're suffering violence themselves, etc., etc. So what is going on? They're being taught in this system, which has taught them how to treat women that way. The young students are being, many times, the only way to stay working there is following these kinds of procedures, even if they don't want to. They're being taught in this system. Just to give you a very good example, in Chile, interviewing many obstetricians, they will tell you Chilean women need so many cesarean sections, we have 50%, because we have a bad pelvis, a very small pelvis. So then you go to physical anthropology and you say this cannot be true, like pelvis are pelvises and they can give birth. And if you go to the textbook we are using, it says that the Chilean pelvis is a very narrow pelvis compared to other populations. And if you go back to the quote of this data, you go back to a thesis of a doctor of 1906. And it's reproduced in the textbook of 2015. And midwives and obstetricians and women will tell you, I couldn't give birth because my pelvis is very narrow and the Chilean pelvises are narrow. So you see how we reproduce things without criticizing them, and then are embedding pathology. So I cannot give birth, look at me, I'm very small. And they will always say, and this will be funny for you, that this is, of course, different from the Norwegian countries, Scandinavian countries, because these women are big and have big pelvises. One doctor in an interview even told me he was going to come to live here because the women had these wonderful pelvises. And I'm like, oh my God. So when you get a Chilean obstetrician, you will understand. So, and this, they don't always come hand by hand. Because what's happening now is you have these beautiful private clinics where women are treated very well, they have the best service, but they have 100% cesareans. So it can go hand by hand, it cannot, but it's two elements of the same problem, let's say. So it's a model, it's like a... And we have these these are 2 birthing rooms in Chile, in 2 public hospitals. So you have this technocratic model and this humanistic model, hand by hand. What is going on here? Of course, there are many women having these births as well, but in many, many countries, this is the very absolute minority of the women. Most of women are having births here. What has been discussed and done so far, and where is this concept coming from? And our colleague here, Lola Ruiz-Verdún, where are you, Lola? There, has retrieved, look at this date, 1828, a quote from the London Medical Gazette. Floodings, tremendous lacerations, inversions of the uterus, like those which now stand on the table before you, such are the effects of obstetric violence, ferocious and atrocious obstetric violence. So we didn't come up to the concept. This concept was there for long. What has happened? There has been a growing acknowledgement of the unnecessary interventions. You know well the declaration of 1985 of the World Health Organization, where they were already worried for the rising levels of unnecessary interventions with all of these problems. Then we have two important moments in, as I told you earlier, in 2000 and 2003, these very big networks were formed in Spain and in Latin America, which have been very influential in moving the agenda forward for the humanization of childbirth. In Latin America, it's mainly been called humanization of childbirth. The concept has had a lot of critiques because we are humans, whatever. Respected childbirth, every country has a name, but it's what we're talking here in the cost is the same. And what is interesting, and here is when this concept begins to be used, 2007 in Venezuela, there is a law of gender violence, and one of the types of violence against women is called as obstetric violence. And it's defined as all the mistreatment and all the ways we can mistreat women, plus all the unnecessary interventions. So from there onwards, many other countries take the same definition and the same name and put it in their own agendas. So then Argentina and Mexico have laws, other countries have projects of laws. Argentina has moved it from the gender violence to an agenda of humanization of childbirth. In Chile, we have a project of law, which is a very bad project, and it just copies the Venezuelan, which we are trying to reframe as a project of a broader model of respectful childbirth and with a lot of structural components. And this is very interesting. The Venezuelan law defines obstetric violence as the appropriation of the body and reproductive processes of women by health personnel, which is expressed as dehumanized treatment, abuse of medication, and to convert the natural processes into pathological ones, bringing with it loss of autonomy and the ability to decide freely about their bodies and sexuality, negatively impacting the quality of life of women. And then it comes down to smaller items or smaller dimensions which are considered obstetric violence. As you see, some of them forcing women to give in a supine position, impeding early attachment, altering the natural process, performing delivery via cesarean section. And here you see something interesting that we will comment later. But if you see the definition, it puts a focus on health personnel. It says appropriation of bodily processes by health personnel. Nonetheless, it is framed within a law of gender violence. So we're seeing structural dimensions, gender violence, but we're saying the health professionals are the ones who are doing these things. So then we'll discuss this further. And when we see the cesarean sections, which is one of these forms of obstetric violence, these are European data that you know well. We go from around 15% up to more than 50% in Cyprus. Greece as well goes above 50%. And here we have to ask some important questions. Here we have more countries. These are the OECD countries. And this is the gap between 2000, the change, and 2013. Look here, Turkey, Mexico, Chile. Now Mexico has 50, Chile has 50, Brazil 56 plus. Latin America is all going in this trend and very, very fast. Look at the graphics. Very, very fast. So we have two different sets of questions here in these countries. Here we can be asking, what can we do better? The World Health Organization, in the report, in the declaration in 2015, was it the one of cesarean sections, has said we have to look at smaller groups of population. We have to use the Robson classification, which is one of the projects of this cost action. They're saying that above 10%, there's no decrease in mortality rates. So here, we think we're doing it very well, but are there still unnecessary interventions that we're doing in all the, not only cesarean? And here the question is, apart from that, because of course there are necessary interventions, but what's going on with the way people are getting informed, with the model of birth that is being transmitted to women, with the, here we have another graph of cesareans. The more red are the countries with higher cesarean sections. And here this is a quote of a recent research we finished in Chile, and we interviewed many obstetricians. To justify a cesarean, one can use any argument. It's super easy for us from the medical point of view. If you want to do a cesarean, you will do it. We have thousands of believable arguments that will convince the patient. So you have a lot of women that really think they had necessary cesarean sections, that really believe they couldn't give birth because they had a very good medical reason. But when you come down to the data and you see we have 40% in public health, 75% in private health, this does not add up. And then we have other factors. So we're looking at non-medical factors, which there are many, but one of the main reasons all over the world as well is being economically driven. Because in private health, you will get a salary per birth, in public per shift. So it doesn't matter how many births you go through, you will have your same salary. In private, you can program, and so we are using medical arguments to... Episiotomies is another very interesting topic. We can go intervention by intervention, but here again, what's happening? And we have this very important discussion, all Martin Wagner. Can we think of episiotomy as a form of genital mutilation, for example, when we have countries that have over 70-80% of episiotomies performed to women, and they're all giving birth, of course, in the supine position. Caracas, Venezuela, women waiting for a cesarean section. We have maternities where almost all births are being a cesarean section. And this is not yet considered a public health problem. And we're discussing here all the effects, all the negative effects on babies, on what. And the last years, we have seen a growing amount of literature focused on these issues. We have calling it disrespect, abuse, the WHO statements on prevention and elimination of mistreatment of women. And again, we see, and if we go down to these papers and to the systematic review, that most of the discussion, again, is centered on these interactions, on this personal level of interactions. But some are going beyond, which we find the most interesting. And here we have, for example, the paper by Friedman and Crook, the expectations, meanings, intentions, rationalizations that surround a sharp slap, an angry word, while a woman struggles to push in the final stages of labor, remind us that health systems often reflect the deeper dynamics of power and inequity that shape the broader societies in which they are embedded. We were discussing earlier with Ibone, if we see how much violence we have in these countries and how much gender violence, violence against women, it's very similar to the levels of interventions in childbirth and to the levels of cesareans. This is a very interesting comment on Rachel Jukes and Loveday Penkenana, where they say it's very easy to draw parallels between the mistreatment of women in childbirth and violence against women more broadly. The former should be viewed as a further subset of the latter. It's possible to engage health workers in processes of critical reflection on building understanding and empathy, and show through experiential learning the rewards in terms of job satisfaction that stem from more positive relationships. Engagement needs to be approached without the blaming health workers as a group, as evident points to the widespread impact of social norms on care on individual level practices. Because what's happening now? You have health professionals extremely stressed, burnout, traumatized. Ibone will talk about that. And you're asking them to be compassionate, to treat women well, how can they do that if they don't have the education, the means, it's very difficult to change without asking us this. So the questions have to be before that. We have to ask, and Ibone will talk about that later. And just to finish my part, this was last week, the International Day of Women. There was a joint declaration between 5 observatories of obstetric violence that had been created in the last year or a bit more, from Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Spain, and France, where they say this is a public health problem, blah, blah, blah. All the things that we have been discussing. And they all have Facebook pages, they all have a lot of movement going on. We have groups as Human Rights in Childbirth. There are many movements. There's a big movement around this. these are cases of forced cesarean sections that have had a lot of impact and a lot of discussion as well, which are going, this is in the States, in Brazil. So from there we're going to discuss the consequences of this.
Okay, thank you. Now that we're into the topic, I'll come to the toughest part. But we need to. So first, just shortly to remember how vulnerable women are during childbirth. And this is the moment of maximum vulnerability of our lives, probably, because during childbirth there is an altered state of consciousness. And just to remind you, it's driven by a very specific neurohormonal scenario, which probably makes it, first, that women cannot defend themselves during childbirth. Second, that whatever happens during childbirth is likely to stay imprinted strongly in the woman's brain. So I'm going to use some quotes from some beautiful papers, and I want to thank Sue Down for publishing this work. I think it's very important because we want to change our perspective and looking at these papers from the obstetric violence perspective. So these are quotes from women who gave birth in Lancaster, no, in in the Northwest in England. Okay, this is not from Brazil. This is just words from women, and this is from their paper. Initial readings of the women's traumatic birth narratives uncover repeated descriptions of violence, torture, and abuse. It was like being tortured because I was laid on a bed screaming, begging, really, really begging for it to be turned off. Don't feel I gave birth and I had a baby on that day. I just felt I went into a room and was just assaulted. It was violent and brutal. And in the discussion, Sue and Jill Thompson, they say it very clearly, but I think this happens to many of us. First, we want to name it, but we're afraid of the reaction. The same fear Michelle and I had today presenting this work to you. We're a bit afraid because we don't want to offend, but at the same time we feel the need to name these sufferings caused by violence. So in this paper, Sue and Gillian talk about, like victims of violence, participants frequently recounter their alienation and isolation. Similar to victims of torture, the women's agency was limited, psychologically, helplessness. Similar to the experiences of victims of abuse, women felt that their voice and sense of well were minimized and disregarded. They felt themselves to be a faceless, empty body, devoid of personal identity. So my question is, why did we rephrase? Why did we take away the like and we say as victims of violence, as victims of torture, as victims of abuse? Are we ready to look at this? This is from a quote from another paper by Cheryl Beck. You might know Cheryl Beck. She's the biggest expert on traumatic childbirth. And she was very brave. She started this paper, The Anniversary of Birth Trauma, with this quote in the Nursing Research Journal. In the words of one mother, every day is no longer the celebration of the child, but it's really an anniversary for the rape day. My son was conceived from love and born out of rape. Sheila Kissinger already talked about this. She also already described how women who suffer traumatic births often use the same language as victims of rape. In this paper of birth as rape, there must be an end to the just in case obstetrics. So you probably, I assume most of you are familiar with the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder related to childbirth. And there have been many studies in the past 2 decades that find between 2 and 5% of all women will present post-PTSD following childbirth, but many studies have found that up to 1 out of 3 women will present an incomplete syndrome following childbirth. And most of the studies that have looked at the risk factors have pointed at this. The main risk factor is the perception of inadequate care by the health professionals. The level of obstetric intervention, the lack of support, as Susanne Ayers pointed in this paper published just a month ago. So what's going on? We have all this suffering on the mother side. And also it's very important to remember the suffering of the newborns, because the mothers who suffer from this, their newborns won't find a healthy and happy mother. Many times they find a mother who's devastated. Plus the newborns will also suffer from this violence, but that has being kept invisible as well. But on the other side, what's happening? And I want to talk about this. I want to talk about the suffering from most of these professionals. How is this possible? Most of midwives, most of doctors went into these professions to help women. So what are we talking about? How are we talking about the harm they're causing? And I want to show you their own words. And all the words I'm going to use are words from papers published in scientific journals. And I think they're very relevant because you will see how the professionals are also ready to name this by its name. I was going to talk about, this is the tip of the iceberg, but I'm going to show you the interesting reflections. For example, there have been some work looking at the conflict many hospital midwives have between being with a woman and being with an institution. Okay, I take it. And many midwives have recognized this frustration, this feeling that they were hurting women. And Mavis Kirkham, a midwife from the UK, has looked at this, about how this affects the midwives. But in this work also by Cheryl Beck, she looked at what nurses from the delivery room, this was American nurses, were their accounts. And nurses frequently used phrases such as, the physician violated her, a perfect delivery turned violent, unnecessary roughness with her perineum, I felt like an accomplice to a crime. She looked at the themes from the accounts of these nurses, and there were three big themes. Nurses in the delivery room had felt very helpless, lots of helplessness. They felt that they couldn't help the women. They felt frustrated. They said, why doesn't the doctor listen to me when he's causing unnecessary trauma? And after that, many of them were traumatized, and they had secondary traumatic stress from these situations they had witnessed. And they would go on questioning themselves for years. Did I do something wrong? Would I have prevented this? What should I have done differently? And many of them felt enormous guilt. Like a nurse was saying, I felt like I failed my patient. I let her down. I should have tried to stop the physician. My patient was counting on me to protect her. And from the same study, these are all quotes by nurses. The doctor treated her like a piece of dirt. I felt like I was watching a rape. I'd never felt so powerless, helpless, or useless in my life. I really feel that I failed her. She was counting me to help her, and I let that man torture her. This is all from the same paper, and I think it reflects the huge amount of suffering on the professional sides, which is very important also that we bring this into the picture. It's not just about the women suffering. It's also about many good professionals suffering a lot. In this study, many of these nurses were recalling traumatic births that they had witnesses with very violent situations 20 years later. They still had nightmares. So they had all the criteria of secondary traumatic stress as well. So my colleague Lola and I, we did a preliminary study. We started a research project 2 years ago, and we asked this. We sent this questionnaire online to professionals from Spain. We haven't published yet these results, but I just want to show you some of it. Have you witnessed obstetric violence in your training? 94% said yes. Everybody knew what we were talking about. In your training, do you feel you were taught to execute or be an accomplice to obstetric violence? Again, a majority said yes. Have you felt compelled or pressure to execute actions you consider violent? Again, majority yes. And when we asked them to give us examples of what they meant by this, these were open questions, they gave us these examples. They were taught that they should not explain much to the woman. The less they know, the better. They teach us to protect each other. So if we see a case of violence, we always excuse ourselves. We never tell the woman the truth. You have to dominate childbirth, otherwise the woman loses control. A midwife told us she had been told that. Or very common, accusing the woman of not knowing how to give birth, telling her she's not able to push or she's not doing it properly. This has an enormous cost. And we asked them how had this affected them, and they said, they had depression symptoms. They had left the delivery room crying. I came home crying many times, and I had nightmares. Above all, I have felt deep guilt for having been an indirect accomplice of such violence. And this quote, I've heard it from many midwives in Spain. Midwife training was the period of my life I have cried the most, too often because I felt an accomplice of violence. And we still have this problem in Spain. Many young nurses going to midwife training, and shortly after the start, they're already having health issues themselves because of the severity of the situations they're being exposed to. Many of them told us they had quit working as midwives, they had stopped working at hospitals, and they had chose home birth as an option because they didn't want to be an accomplice. As a Chilean midwifery student resident told Michelle, she cannot be, she was taught this, she was taught she could not be a good midwife getting emotionally involved with a woman. If you take their hand, they will tell you you're not doing your job, you're a midwife, they will say. I cannot show my feelings, I have to be a robot because this is what is expected from me. We expect or we promote professionals' dissociation. Many professionals are taught to leave their emotions out of the delivery room, and that probably has to do a lot. So just to finish and to give some ideas, this paper was published in December, and it's a special issue of the Journal of Perinatology about psychosocial program for NICU parents. But it had this quote that I was very happy to see this for the first time published in a paper. In the ideal intensive care unit for neonate, psychosocial support of both NICU parents and staff should be goals equal in importance to the health and development of babies. I think we should apply this to birth. The health of the birth professionals and the health of the families should be also taken into account, and it's just as important if we want to finish this violence. So I think this is an important thing, that we take into account the mental health of birth attendants. And now, what do we do with all this? I'm sorry, I was already, I show you things that maybe we don't want to see in here, but here we have some suggestions Michelle and I want to do, and just surely we'll go quickly through this, and then we can hear your opinions.
This is kind of wrap up and think of everything we're doing here in the cost action approaches the same issues, but we are trying to think that we have to address these structures, these ideologies. We have to look at education. We have to look at this structural violence that shapes medical systems, because we cannot keep on telling people they're doing a bad job. They're not. They're doing whatever they can in this very difficult context. So in my country, many hospitals, we have one midwife for 5 women, birthing women. So what do you expect of that context? So solutions can not only focus on the individual level. We have to be looking at this other mechanisms, structures, gender, we said, medical education, economic factors, economic perverse incentives that are drawing, making this happen as well. Rethink education, because here we continue talking. We have health scientists, we have social scientists, we have so much to learn about each other. But why don't we learn to teach jointly with more interdisciplinary research, ask the questions from the beginning integratively, because as long as we continue thinking of health sciences on one side and social sciences on the other, we're not asking the correct questions. We're still thinking that there's a body differed from a social, psychological, cultural context, and it's not, it's all the same. And I'm sure that if we put a sample of random healthy Chilean women here in this room with a random sample of healthy Scandinavian women, and we put them to give birth, the Chilean will develop more pathology because they don't believe they can give birth, because they have embodied the fear of birth, the violence, the abuse. They have been told that if they behave well, they will be giving anesthesia, that they have to be quiet, that they have been told horrible stories. They have been told their pelvis is not able to give birth. So that will, with this woman, what hormones will she be producing? What then? All of what we're discussing here. So it's not about. We cannot dissociate. We have to go further in this way of thinking. We have to teach critical thinking, because we cannot just start by students telling them this is the way things are done. We have to tell them you have to criticize the way things are being done, and you have to read this book and be able to think that it's not possible that the pelvis is wrong to give birth if we have survived as a species. And you have to be, and we have to continue researching the physiology of birth, which is what we're doing here, and the salutogenesis. We have to, but still, if we go to many contexts around the world, this is not the framework we're working from. We're still working, as we saw in those slides, we're still working with the women on their back in these horrible birth tables with all the light, with people shouting. So this is what students are seeing, this is what women are feeling, this is what's happening. And we have to go back to the humanistic model. We have to remember, again, Robert Davis Floyd and go further, because then she talks about the holistic model. So we have to see why are we still so, we're still in the technocratic model in most of the world. So what do we have to do to jump to this other side of the way of seeing things?
And this is just a picture of a bracelet made by women for other women for her birth. But I like this idea of each woman putting, a piece of the bracelet. Because for me, that's an image of healing. And we have to do a lot of healing, all of us. Because most of us have been touched by this somehow, either as workers, either as mothers, either sometimes as daughters or sons. So we need to do the healing for all of us, not just for the traumatized women, but also, of course, for the babies and the families, but also for the professionals. And I think we have to create spaces where the professionals can reflect on themselves and can talk and can start healing. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So we can think about how to do that. And just to finish, because we wanted to finish with this, no? Because every woman and every baby and every family deserves a birth without violence, but also every professional deserves to work in a violence-free work setting. So that's the goal, and we hope that putting the light on obstetric violence, we are helping move in this direction. Thank you.